Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Jennifer Oliver O'Connell. As the Girl Turns, and you are in my orbit on redstate.com and substack.com. I get the pleasure of speaking with Nathan Hochman. He is the attorney, the former U.S. District Attorney, and a number of awesome pedigree behind his name. He's got a ton of experience running for the Los Angeles County District Attorney. As many of you know, especially my Red State readers, George Gascon is the current district attorney, and he has made a disaster of the office, not only among his staff, but kind of done damage to the concept of law and order and the concept of justice. And I'm going to talk to Nathan about that, as well as about the race and how things are going so far. Welcome, Nathan. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here, Jennifer. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. So please tell us about your background. There are so many named politicians and serial politicians in the Los Angeles County and even in California. Your name is a relatively new one to a lot of voters. Tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you. And that's probably because I'm not a politician, as you're about to hear, which I actually view as a positive. So I'm a lifelong Angelino. I was born here, grew up here, married my wife now 30 years here, raised my 3 children here. And I've watched what George Gascon has done to our crime situation in Los Angeles County. And there's 3 reactions that people have had. One is they've left LA. Basically taxes didn't get them out, smog, traffic, but you add crime on top of it, you add homeless on top of it, and they voted with their feet and left. The second reaction has been to complain from the sidelines. I understand that. But the third reaction is actually to do something about it. And I have a fairly unique skill set that allows me to replace George Gascon and restore our public safety on day one. And that skill set goes back. I graduated Brown University, Stanford Law School, came back to LA and clerked for a federal judge, and went right to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I was a federal prosecutor for 7 years. I went after violent gang members, narcotics traffickers, international money launderers. I went after corrupt public officials and cops. I ran the environmental crime section and went after air, sea, and land polluters. I ran the LA Disaster Fraud Task Force and went after people who ripped off the federal government's aid efforts when they gave $2 billion to LA County. There were people, as you can well imagine, who ripped that off. I started a task force. I had 15 federal, state, and local officers, all part of it. We brought 70 cases in 6 months and brought back in $25 million and another $25 million in the amnesty program we arranged. Then about 10 years after that, President George W. Bush nominated me to be the U.S. Assistant Attorney General of the U.S. Department of Justice's Tax Division in Washington, D.C. I got unanimous Senate confirmation approval, which doesn't happen every day. Went back to D.C., ran a division with a $100 million budget and 350 lawyers doing cases all over the nation. When I finished that, I came back to Los Angeles, was the head of 2 major international law firms' government investigations practices, and along the way was the president of the LA City Ethics Commission and the co-founder of the LA Sheriff's Foundation. And the reason I give you this background is I think a DA, if you want to run for DA, you better be qualified and experienced to be the DA on day one. It's an office, it's actually the largest local prosecuting office in the United States. It has about 1,000 lawyers, 1,100 staff on top of that, in addition to a $460 million budget, bigger than 16 states' entire enforcement budgets. That's LA County. So you want to run an organization that complex, that big, that important, because it brings 100,000 criminal cases a year in the county. You better be ready to do so on day one, and I absolutely will be.
That is quite a huge endorsement, definitely, especially with the experience. I mean, we have several candidates running who were either former DAs, deputy DAs, or had some other form of experience. Why do you not think just being a deputy DA would be suited to actually running the entire department?
Well, let's start out with our current DA, George Gascon. And the contrast with him couldn't be more stark. He is literally, and this is, you're going to hold on to your seat because what I'm about to tell you might shock you. He literally has not personally prosecuted or defended a criminal case in his life, yet he's been the DA of San Francisco and Los Angeles. That's absolutely astounding. Because how do you lead the troops when you've never done it yourself? I mean, it'd be like going in for surgery and finding out your heart surgeon who's about to open you up has never done heart surgery. He's a dermatologist.
Mm,
George Gascon is like a dermatologist pretending to be a heart surgeon, to use that analogy.
mm,
And again, the issue with George Gascon is that he lacks all experience, which explains his very pro-criminal blanket policies that have made us less safe. As far as the other people running, again, a lot of them are very good trial attorneys, and their best and highest use would be my elevating them in my administration to make sure they do the toughest cases out there. But it's a big stretch from going to be a good trial attorney or even a very good trial attorney to running an office with 2,100 people and a $460 million budget. If you haven't done that before, if you haven't, I battled, for instance, Congress when I was in the U.S. Department of Justice. I battled the rest of the U.S. Department of Justice advocating for a division. I had to deal with 94 U.S. attorneys' offices all over the United States. I
mm.
have the experience to lead the office, and that's the key, one of the key drivers. I also, by the way, have defense experience in addition to prosecution experience that none of the other prosecutors have. And I think that gives me a certain sensitivity to calibrate the line to make sure that the true threats to our public safety are behind bars, and those who aren't, like a first-time nonviolent offender, basically gets community service or gets a diversion program. Most importantly, gets held accountable for their actions. But if they're at the crossroads in their life where if you give them a chance and they make the right decision, they're never back in the criminal justice system, you have helped the entire system by giving them that chance. I call that the hard middle, which is a rejection of each extreme, mass incarceration on one end and George Gascon's de-incarceration or no incarceration on the other.
Is there really a true case in the United States or even in California where that hard middle has actually worked? We see that obviously the throw them in jail for 1,000 years does not work. We also see that George Gascon's horror show of coddle the criminals and send them out and everything will work itself out doesn't work. But where have we seen anyone attempting the hard middle where it has been successful?
I'll give you one of its biggest advocates, Steve Cooley. Steve Cooley, the 3-term, 12-year LA County District Attorney, who's endorsed me from the beginning of this race, actually worked with a lot of the other candidates, but endorsed me in this race. He effectively practiced the hard middle, rejecting, again, the extremes of mass incarceration and no incarceration, to doing an individualized look at each defendant, the crime committed, and the impact on the victim to figure out where to calibrate that line. And that's the key. So for instance, 3 strikes policy. You want to make sure that if you're going to put someone in jail on that 3rd strike for 25 years to life, that all 3 strikes are violent and serious offenses, which is actually what the law has ended up being. But the law didn't start there when it was passed in 1994. Steve Cooley helped the law evolve to where all 3 strikes deal with violent and serious offenses, which I believe is the correct way of looking at it. So again, I think that the idea of the hard middle is a tried and true prosecutorial philosophy for successful prosecutors. It's foreign to George Gascon because he's never been one.
That makes sense. Now, speaking of George Gascon and his missteps, one of the biggest ones was the case of James Hannah Tubbs, who violently assaulted a young girl in a Denny's bathroom. She was 11 years old. He was 17 on the edge of 18. Ended up getting caught again for a different crime. And that's when they found out about this crime. And of course, this is like close to 10, 11 years later. And Gascon doesn't prosecute him, doesn't try him as an adult, basically gives him a slap on the wrist. And he ends up going into prison and, claiming he's transgender, as well as claiming that I'll never get caught for this. I'll get away with it. Bragging to his father how he's going to work the system. And George Gascon has been called to account on it. The poor victim has basically said, I don't believe anything's going to happen. How would you have handled that differently? How would you have brought compassion coupled with law and order into that situation?
So this is a perfect example of how George Gascon's blanket policies failed. So one of his blanket policies that he announced on the day that he took office was that he was never going to prosecute a juvenile in adult court, and basically find the juvenile unfit for juvenile court and prosecute them in adult court. Now, for the overwhelming majority of juveniles, that's the appropriate decision. The juveniles should be prosecuted for the majority of cases in juvenile court. But there are exceptions, and Hannah Tubbs was the exception, where you have, because one of the things about prosecuting a juvenile in juvenile court is that the most you can keep them effectively locked up is till the age of 25. Then they age out at that point. So what happened in Tubbs' situation is they didn't get around to locating Tubbs till Tubbs was about 26. So unless you prosecute Tubbs as an adult for a heinous crime, a very violent sexual assault on a 10-year-old, then what happens in juvenile court is you got to let Hannah Tubbs out effectively, because at that point, Tubbs is older than 25. And so what happened is that it became a media problem for George Gascon, because the prosecutor who was in charge of this went to the media and said, this is an outrage. We can't let Tubbs out. Look what Tubbs did. We got to try effectively transfer Tubbs to adult court, but Gascon said no way. In fact, he even modified his policy afterwards to allow very few exceptions so he wouldn't be embarrassed in the future. But the overwhelming majority of Tubbs-type cases are still prosecuted in juvenile court, which means that they are let out even if they're older than 25.
That just seems like a trap, particularly for the victims. They actually get, they don't get justice, they don't get any type of closure, and they live in fear, frankly.
Well, and that's just it, because what you're doing, part of the purpose of prosecution is not only punishing the individual in front of you and making sure they won't be around to ever do it again, but you need to send a strong message to other people thinking about doing that crime, that if they do that, the consequences are going to be proportional but significant. And what you're effectively telling all juveniles under George Gascon's administration is that you can commit a whole variety of crimes in LA County, and you're going to be held, if at all, minimally accountable. And so that is an incentivization rather than a de-incentive or deterrence to committing criminal conduct in LA County.
And that seems to be the escalation of crime, particularly among youth, not only in large businesses. Adidas just closed its offices in San Francisco because it can't pay the price anymore of these smash and grab robberies, the crime, the vagrancy on the street. But you also have small businesses that are just truly hurting, and they don't have the market share of these larger businesses to survive. They basically either have to keep their doors open or close permanently, and wherever can they rebuild. That's a very difficult thing. I've noticed that you, in your campaigning, have been going around and speaking to these small business owners. How have they responded to your policies on crime?
Well, they started out by telling me by almost shaking their head when I asked them about how things are going, how things are, whether or not they think crime is going up or down in the last several years since Gascon has been the DA. They're all saying that crime is basically out of control. I went recently to Reuben's Bakery, which is a 48-year-old bakery in Compton, California. And what had happened on January 2nd at 3 a.m. is that there was a street closure And by that, I mean basically dozens of cars parked in an intersection at 3 a.m. right in front of the bakery and lit a mattress on fire. Then someone with a white Kia, and you might have seen this on social media, backs up the Kia into the entrance of Reuben's Bakery, taking down the iron grill. And they estimate over 100 youths, people under the age of 18, run into Reuben's Bakery and ransack it. Why? Because they know that George Gascon has an absolute policy against prosecuting misdemeanor violations against juveniles. And if they steal less than $950, it's going to be a misdemeanor theft at that point. And even if it's charged as a burglary, it can be, if it's played down to a misdemeanor, he's not prosecuting the misdemeanors. So again, what he has done is he's incentivized people, especially juveniles, to ransack places like Reuben's Bakery. The owner of Reuben's Bakery, who I talked to, he said, "What am I going to do? We've been here 48 years. I'm not moving. I need, and luckily the community rallied around him. They actually raised close to $50,000 on a GoFundMe page to get him back in business, which is absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
The community should be applauded for that. But we shouldn't have to rely on people coming up with money for businesses that have been destroyed because of George Gascon's policies. We need to replace Gascon to avoid those policies causing this type of damage in the future.
Now you have a huge lead in the polls. Most head-to-head polls are showing that you are the one to replace Gascon, not some of the other candidates. And you're also had a huge fundraising boom, which allows you to continue your campaign with ease, maybe throw out some television ads. How do you plan on using that funding to further reach out to the, for lack of a better word, the low information voter, the ones that kind of have their heads down, not paying attention, but really should be getting out on March 5th?
We've been very fortunate to have been able to get our message out to a lot of people, and people have been incredibly generous in supporting the campaign. In fact, we've hit record-breaking fundraising amounts. We're over $1.3 million. The prior record was under $1 million. I've got almost 2 times more raised than Gascon himself or any other challenger. So we're going to take that money and go all over the county. And we're going to reach people on the way people get their information, whether it's TV, radio, social media, or mail. And we're going to bring them the message of common sense enforcement, which is what we've been lacking. Crimes actually do have consequences. People need to be held accountable. And they need a DA who wants to follow the law rather than enact their own independent, their own political ideology and decide that there are just certain crimes and certain criminals that he doesn't want to prosecute. That's not what a DA does when he raises his right hand and he swears to uphold the law. There's no asterisk in that oath. It's all the laws. And George Gascon has basically used a political ideology to decide who he's going to prosecute. And I would go back to bringing independence back to the DA's office, where the only thing we're focused on are the facts and the law to make our decisions.
That is an incredibly hopeful message. If I still lived in Los Angeles, I definitely would, be rallying around that. For those who are skeptical, though, you have a whole generation of Generation Z, Generation Alpha, who have kind of been spoon-fed this social justice mantra, and they think anything else, it's just hardline. I noticed that you are doing a bit with your daughter, talking about what matters to Los Angeles, what matters to her generation. How do you plan to use that to reach out to that generation that kind of needs a primer on what true justice really is about?
Well, what's interesting is I think the young generation is, for the first time in their life, seeing what happens when they can't take their safety for granted. When all of a sudden, we've got homeless encampments in areas we've never had them before, and I mean dangerous homeless encampments, where people are being shot, where you've got, used needles and syringes littering the sidewalks because that's, they're not cleaning up after they get done, doing their drug use out there in public. I think what's happening, where people are getting robbed, where their neighbors are getting robbed, their families are suffering from robberies. I think this is the first time possibly in young people's lives where they're seeing it up close. What happens when their society breaks down and a DA decides he no longer really wants to be in the business of enforcing the law. So we're getting out there on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the different types of media to reach the people, to make them understand that this DA election really matters. The DA on day one, as George Gascon showed us, can change the policies governing 100,000 criminal cases and 1,000 lawyers. He or she is that powerful a position. And when I become DA on day one, we will reverse course on George Gascon's pro-criminal blanket policies and bring back that hard middle that really reestablishes the trust and credibility with the public, reestablishes that trust with your own prosecutors, reestablishes that partnership with law enforcement. And we'll do that from day one.
There was a department that Gascon pretty much wiped out, where the prosecutors helped to, first of all, coach the victims or those testifying, prepare them for what they're going to face. And Gascon said, we don't need that, go away. There's another department where basically the prosecutors would keep track of these cases and alert the victims' families if the person was coming up for parole or possibly would get early release. Gascon chose to wipe that out as well. Do you plan on bringing those back or some form of those programs back into the DA's office?
Absolutely. The victim doesn't stop being a victim when the court case is done and someone gets convicted and goes off to jail. Because very often, especially in the cases in which parole might be eligible, some of these life sentences with the possibility of parole, eventually there will be a parole hearing. And what's happened over and over and over again before George Gascon is that the deputy district attorney would accompany the victim to the parole board, because only the deputy district attorney gets to see the information that's being presented to the parole board. The deputy district attorney can present the prison packet and sort of the packet explaining what happened down below, why the person ended up in prison in the first place. And as importantly, the deputy will be there with the victim when the victim confronts the person that very well may have killed one or more of their family members. An incredibly traumatic event. And having the sort of the white knight, the prosecutor next to you, is incredibly important, but not for George Gascon. George Gascon would just assume that person get out of jail as fast as possible. So he's prohibited his prosecutors from going to parole hearings with the victim. That would change on day one.
It's hard for me to believe how anyone can cope with that type of outcome for other people. It's one thing to have your own security and your own policies on how things should be run. It's another thing just to basically re-victimize the victims, which is what is happening under Gascon and under his watch. What do you think your prospects are? Primaries aren't great nationally for people showing up, and they're really bad in Los Angeles. I think maybe 40 is generous. 30% of people show up actually to vote in Los Angeles. What do you think your prospects are at present?
I think our prospects are excellent. Our recent polling showed, not surprisingly, that George Gascon is the most unpopular politician in LA County. That if the primary election was held tomorrow, I would come in the top two, which is what you have to come in order to make the general runoff in November. And the primary is March 5th coming up. And then if that election was being run today, the general election, the head-to-head match between myself and George Gascon, I would beat him by 15 to 20 points. And again, that's an indication of both how weak George Gascon is, what a bad job he has done. I mean, there's a reason that 97.8% of his own prosecutors, those are the 900 prosecutors, voted to support his recall. I mean, that's a shocking statistic in and of itself. But that sentiment that we are no longer as safe as we used to be, and it's because of George Gascon, now is cutting across the political spectrum. It's not just Republicans. Democrats, independents as well, are afraid of their own safety. They're afraid for their children, for themselves, for their parents, their neighbors. They look at their parks, their subways, their streets, their neighborhoods, and this is not the type of situation they want to live in. But the solution, or at least one solution, is get rid of one of the main problems, which is George Gascon. And I'm encouraging everybody to get to the voting booth. The absentee ballots come out on February 5th. The election's March 5th. And if the people show up, the people in LA County who are truly being affected in a negative way by George Gascon's policy show up, then I'm confident I will make the top 2 in March and beat him in the runoff in November.
And a confident politician is what one needs if someone that they can stand behind and believe in. It seems like there's so many people running for office who want to equivocate and play the messy middle as opposed to be decisive about who they are. You want that in law enforcement, definitely, but you really want it across the board. I think that's probably part of the reason why your campaign is resonating, because you are presenting that face of, I can confidently do the job. Here's what I'm going to do in this job. And you just need people to support and vote and get behind you. Where can they find your campaign information, any campaign stops you're making?
My website is probably a good place to start. It's at Nathan Hochman, NathanHochman.com.
Excellent. Well, we will be watching over on Red State as well as other places to see what occurs, and hope our biggest hope obviously is that Gascon be eliminated. But again, you are fighting a good fight as well as running a credible race. So best of luck to you in that.
Well, and thank you as well for doing what you're doing, which is helping us get the word out. If there were more, Jennifer Oliver O'Connell's out there, doing these podcasts and these broadcasts, it would really help, actually, because I think people want the information, and sometimes it's hard to get, but when you're helping them get the information, then they can make that informed decision when they get to the ballot box. And I believe in an informed decision in this particular case. We'll have them voting for me, Nathan Hochman, for district attorney. And again, thank you so much for letting me be on your show.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Very good.
I'm Jennifer. Yeah, I'm Jennifer Oliver O'Connell. As the Girl Turns, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, now X, Instagram, Telegram, True Social, and Getter. Have an awesome day, afternoon, evening, weekend. Ciao.